World Model 7.0 maps global systemic risk. Projections isolate a vulnerability spike between 2030 and 2032, where the probability of systemic collapse hits 57.45%. This represents the mathematical exhaustion of systemic shock absorbers, marking the point where supply chains fragment and financial reserves are fully depleted. We are observing the onset of a polycrisis. This is the compounding collision of ecological degradation, geopolitical conflict, and supply chain failure, systems that once operated independently but now generate feedback loops that amplify global instability. State administrations are currently locked in a reactive cycle, burning through finite capital and public trust to mask these effects. They are subsidizing energy costs and emitting mass currency just to maintain the illusion of stability. These reserves of capital and resilience are strictly finite. By the end of this decade, the overlapping costs of the energy transition and a rapidly aging population will have drained the remaining systemic buffers. Navigating this narrow window requires a total structural reorganization of society. This transition marks the mathematical endpoint for liberal democracy and historical biological humanity. This pressure has been compounding for decades. Since the mid-20th century, systemic models have accurately mapped the intersection of demographic growth and resource constraints. This replicates the business-as-usual to trajectory from limits to growth. Technology doubles resource extraction, shifting the cause of collapse to extreme pollution. The extraction curve peaks here. By the 2030s, this stress triggers a physical squeeze, causing agricultural and energy output to plummet. Under conditions of life-threatening scarcity, market mechanisms become a liability. If left to the free market, prices of water, food, and energy would trigger immediate anarchy, making resource allocation a matter of direct national security. Ecological scarcity necessitates the end of free market allocation. To keep populations alive, states must adopt centralized, authoritarian control over every vital resource. The primary stressor breaking modern governance is the dramological trap. Dramology is the science of speed, and it explains why human institutions are physically incapable of governing a reality that is accelerating beyond their reach. This diagram compares 4 speeds of adaptation. Institutions move at a glacial pace. Society assimilates change slightly faster. Biological cognition is flat, capped by evolution. Finally, artificial general intelligence rockets exponentially upward, completely decoupling from human limits. Democratic deliberation requires a slow timeframe to function. Procedural checks and public debates are luxuries that disappear when crises are moving at an exponential pace. As the polycrisis outpaces human decision-making, it triggers administrative abdication. Human officials are physically forced to delegate strategic resource allocation to opaque algorithms because they can no longer process the variables. This shift to an algocracy, governance by algorithms, is a thermodynamic necessity for processing reality rather than a political choice. Managing the ecological scarcity predicted by BAU2 requires a physical infrastructure that can bypass traditional civil rights. This mandatory fusion of digital identity and programmable central bank digital currencies locks your biological identity and transactionability into a single node. This enables algorithmic carbon quotas. An automated filter can instantly reject a fuel transaction if your carbon meter is depleted. State coercion is moving from physical violence to psychopolitics. Psychopolitics uses a data-driven power that directs behavior through algorithmic seduction and hyper-personalized digital environments. Populations exhausted by the polycrisis will voluntarily surrender their behavioral data. Total surveillance will be accepted as a trade-off for algorithmic comfort and the delivery of vital resources. Authoritarian environmentalism succeeds because it frames the suspension of civil rights as a permanent ecological quarantine, necessary for the survival of the species. In the West, the initial response to cognitive technology is a defensive, bioconservative legal framework. Governments are attempting to codify inalienable neurorights to protect the unaugmented mind. Thinkers like Leon Kass warn that neuroaugmentation will degrade human dignity, altering the very nature of human existence. This bioconservative stance is supported by broad academic consensus, including voices like Francis Fukuyama, who view neural intervention as a threat to the democratic order. This matrix illustrates the geopolitical security dilemma. Western democracies remain biologically defensive, while Eastern autocracies aggressively pursue civil-military fusion. If the West maintains bioethical barriers, while a rival hybridizes, the inevitable result is Western epistemic and military extinction. This creates the cataconic paradox. A biological human commander is instantly obsolete on a silicon-governed battlefield. Against a post-human adversary linked directly to autonomous drone swarms, a biological brain cannot compete with this hive mind entity. The threat of military subjugation will force democracies to abandon their own neurorights. To survive, they will be structurally compelled to mandate the same cybernetic augmentations they once sought to ban. In evolutionary terms, we are entering a phase of anagenesis. This is a linear, forced evolutionary leap, where a species is completely replaced by a new, more adapted form. The driver of this leap is the environment. The compounding stress of the polycrisis inflicts a chronic environmental trauma on the unaugmented population. This chart shows the human cognitive baseline splitting. For the unaugmented, extreme stress triggers epigenetic degradation, suppressing neuroplasticity across generations. Simultaneously, an elite population shifts radically to the right. Using polygenic screening and neural interfacing, they create a permanent physical gap from the biological baseline. Resource inequality is transforming into a hardwired genomic divergence. The difference between populations is no longer socioeconomic, it is biological. The final stage of anagenesis is a cellular-level fusion. Human neuroplasticity must wrap around and integrate with synthetic processors to manage a planetary system that has become too complex for organic life. Historical humanity faces extinction through a forced evolutionary override, replaced by a cybernetic hybrid optimized for a collapsing environment. By 2050, the geopolitical landscape will be stripped of political alternatives. On the left, Western tech monopolies and state security merge into a techno-aristocracy. On the right, Eastern mineral and surveillance monopolies form an extractive oligarchy. Locked in mimetic rivalry, they copy each other, converging into one impenetrable black box, the universal algorithmic state. Within this black box state, deliberative democracy is replaced by cold thermodynamic optimization. Decision-making is hidden, occurring at speeds and scales beyond human comprehension. Historical humanity fades through mandatory software updates and genetic overrides, bypassing the cinematic nuclear flash of earlier fiction. Survival is secured, but at the irreversible cost of the biological bodies and political architectures that once defined human history.